She buried her husband with her bare hands, and the snow hadn't even stopped falling. Pregnant and penniless, the young widow set out west with nothing but a Bible, a rifle, and the promise of a new beginning. What she found instead was cruelty, a man being sold like cattle in a lawless town where justice cost more than gold. But this cowboy wasn't broken, not yet. He'd lost everything, his land, his name, his will to fight. Chained, bruised, and silent, he was one bit away from disappearing forever until she stepped forward and did something unthinkable. She saved him. Not out of pity, not out of weakness, but because something in his haunted eyes mirrored her own. Pain. Together they flee into the frontier where the land is wild, the nights are long, and trust is the rarest currency. She carries life inside her. He carries death in his memories, but as winter closes in, they begin to heal. Not through words, but through hard work, shared burdens, and quiet glances by firelight. This is a story of two broken hearts who refused to stay buried. A tale of love that didn't come easy, didn't come pretty, but came just in time. In the West, salvation comes in strange forms. Sometimes it looks like a woman with nothing left to give, giving someone a reason to live again. But what happens when the past catches up to them in the unforgiving wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Rose Caldwell had always believed that faith could move mountains, but she'd never imagined it would require her to move them one frozen shovelful at a time. The preacher's daughter had married for love at 19, choosing James Caldwell over 3 more prosperous suitors because his eyes held kindness and his hands knew honest work. Their wedding had been simple. Wildflowers from the prairie, her mother's dress taken in at the waist, and promises spoken beneath an October sky, so blue it hurt to look upon. James had dreams that stretched beyond the Missouri settlement where they'd met. He spoke of fertile valleys in Montana Territory, of land that could be claimed for the price of courage and persistence. Together, they'd saved every penny, planning their westward journey like generals mapping a campaign. Margaret would press her hand to her still flat belly and imagine children running through wheat fields that existed only in their shared visions. The fever took him on a Tuesday morning in late November, swift and merciless as a prairie fire. One day he was splitting wood for their cabin, whistling hymns her father had taught him, and by Friday she was pressing her ear to his chest, listening for breath that would never come again. The doctor from town arrived too late, his horses, hooves crunching through snow that had fallen like a burial shroud over their homestead. Margaret had refused help digging the grave. Something deep and primitive in her soul demanded that she alone commit her husband's body to the frozen earth. Her hands had bled through her woolen gloves, blisters forming and breaking as she chipped away at ground hard as granite. The simple wooden cross James had carved for their cabin door now marked his resting place, and Margaret had knelt there in the snow until her knees were numb and her tears had frozen on her cheeks. The baby had quickened that very night, as if sensing its father's departure and asserting its own claim on life. Margaret had placed her hand over the gentle flutter and made a promise that would sustain her through the dark months ahead. This child would know the Montana valleys James had dreamed of, would feel prairie grass beneath its feet and breathe air untainted by sorrow. The journey west had been harder than any Sunday sermon about trials and tribulations could have prepared her for. Wagons broke down in muddy ruts, oxen sickened and died, and fellow travelers revealed the worst of human nature when provisions ran low. Margaret learned to sleep with James's rifle across her lap and to trust no one completely. The $17 sewn into her coat lining represented everything she owned in the world, and she guarded it with the fierce protectiveness of a she-wolf. Other women on the trail whispered about her condition, their voices carrying the particular kind of sympathy reserved for widows and orphans. Some offered practical help, shared blankets on cold nights, extra portions when her stomach rebelled against the constant motion. Others maintained a careful distance, as if her misfortune might prove contagious. Margaret learned to accept a kindness gracefully while keeping her guard up, understanding that charity often came with strings attached. The baby made its presence known in increasingly uncomfortable ways as the weeks passed. Her back ached constantly, and the simple act of climbing in and out of her wagon became a study in creative engineering. She'd fashioned a belly support from strips of canvas and learned to time her rest stops with the baby's most active periods. The child seemed to have inherited its father's restless energy, kicking and turning as if eager to break free and explore the world. Winter had been closing in when the wagon train reached the crossroads settlement of Bitter Creek, Montana Territory. The town squatted in a valley like a canker on the landscape, its buildings thrown together from green lumber and desperate ambition. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, promising warmth, but the promise felt hollow when Margaret caught sight of the gallows that dominated the town square, and the wooden platform beside it that served a purpose she preferred not to contemplate. To see. A wagon master, a grizzled man named Hutchins, who'd made this journey 17 times, had pulled her aside with words that made her blood run cold. "Ma'am, I'll speak plain because you seem a sensible woman. This ain't a place for decent folks to linger. You get what supplies you need and catch up with us come morning, you hear?" But morning had brought a blizzard that made travel impossible, and Margaret found herself stranded in Bitter Creek with a handful of other travelers who'd been caught by the sudden storm. The town's only boarding house was full, leaving her to seek shelter wherever she could find it. The saloon keeper, a hollow-eyed woman named Pearl, had offered her a corner of the storeroom for $2, a fortune when survival hung in the balance. The room was barely large enough for Margaret to stretch out her bedroll, and it smelled of stale beer and something else she couldn't identify. Through the thin walls, she could hear raucous laughter, breaking glass, and conversations conducted in languages she didn't recognize. Sleep came in fitful snatches, interrupted by the baby's increasingly urgent movements and the growing certainty that something was deeply wrong with this place. Dawn brought no relief, only the sound of hammering from the town square. Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and ventured outside to find men constructing something that made her stomach clench with foreboding. The wooden platform was being expanded, fitted with iron rings and shackles that gleamed dully. In the grey morning light, auction day, Pearl explained, when Margaret returned to the saloon with questions burning on her tongue. "Happens twice a month, regular as church services, though I reckon the preacher wouldn't approve of what gets sold here." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby rolled and kicked as if sensing her distress. She'd heard whispers on the trail about places where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, but she'd dismissed them as tall tales meant to frighten travelers. The evidence before her eyes suggested otherwise. The crowd that gathered in the town square that afternoon represented the worst of frontier society. Rough men with cruel eyes and careless laughs examined potential purchases like farmers evaluating cattle. The sheriff, a man whose badge seemed more ornament than authority, lounged against a post with the lazy indifference of someone long past caring about justice. Margaret noticed how his eyes lingered on the women in the crowd, cataloguing them. With an expression that made her skin crawl, she should have returned to her room, should have pulled her bedroll over her head and waited for the storm to pass. Instead, some combination of morbid fascination and righteous anger kept her rooted to the spot as the auctioneer, a ferret-faced man in a stained suit, began his grotesque presentation. The first lot consisted of 3 Chinese workers, their faces stoic despite the humiliation of their circumstances. They were sold to a mine owner from the neighboring county, led away in chains while the crowd jeered and made crude jokes about their perceived foreignness. Margaret's father would have called it an abomination, a sin that cried out to heaven for justice. Next came a family of Mexican immigrants, the parents clutching their children while the auctioneer described their various skills and attributes. Like livestock at a county fair, the mother's tears fell silently as her family was split up, sold to different buyers who had no interest in keeping them together. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat, but still she couldn't look away. Then they brought out the cowboy, and everything changed. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years under open sky. His clothes had once been fine, good leather boots, wool trousers, a shirt that had been white before blood and dirt had claimed it. Shackles bound his wrists and ankles, but he carried himself with a dignity that the chains couldn't touch. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes, those eyes held depths of pain that made Margaret's heart catch in her throat. The auctioneer was speaking, his voice carrying across the square. With the practiced ease of a carnival barker, here we have Elias Kane, former rancher from the Paradise Valley, strong as an ox, knows horses and cattle, can work leather and iron, been eating regular, so he's got plenty of strength left in him. Bidding starts at $50. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized what she was witnessing. This wasn't just human trafficking. It was the systematic destruction of a man's life, dignity stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but flesh to be bartered and sold. The cowboy, Elias Kane, stood motionless on the platform, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if he could will himself out of this nightmare through sheer force of imagination. The bidding was swift and brutal. Men called out numbers like they were purchasing equipment, their voices carrying no recognition that they were haggling over a human soul. Margaret watched Elias's face for some sign of emotion, fear, anger, desperation, but found only a terrible emptiness that spoke of a spirit pushed beyond its breaking point. $50 became $60, then $75. The crowd was growing restless, eager to move on to the next lot, when a voice cut through the din with shocking clarity. $100. The auctioneer's head swiveled to locate the bidder, and Margaret realized with dawning horror that the voice had been her own. Every eye in the square turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical blow. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where the baby seemed to have gone still, as if sensing the magnitude of what its mother had just done. The auctioneer recovered first, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like a well-worn mask. $100 from the lady. Do I hear 110? For a moment, Margaret thought her impulsive bid might stand unchallenged. Then a gravelly voice from the back of the crowd spoke up. 120. The man who'd spoken was everything nightmares were made of. Massive shoulders, scarred hands, and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. Margaret had noticed him earlier, the way other men deferred to him, the space that opened around him wherever he moved. This was someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, and apparently he wanted Elias Kane. Margaret's mind raced, calculating the impossible mathematics of survival. She had $17 to her name, barely enough to buy supplies for the remainder of her journey. Bidding $100 was already financial suicide. Anything more would leave her completely destitute in a hostile world with a baby due in mere months. But something in Elias Kane's eyes had called to her, a recognition of shared pain that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. She'd seen that same look in her own mirror during the dark days after James's death, the expression of someone who'd lost everything that mattered and was simply going through the motions of continued existence. Before rational thought could reassert itself, she heard her own voice again, steady despite the trembling in her knees. $150. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the crowd processed this turn of events. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with the prospect of an unexpected profit, while the scarred man turned his full attention to Margaret for the first time. What he saw there, a pregnant woman in worn traveling clothes, seemed to amuse him. $200. he said casually, as if discussing the price of coffee. Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. $200 was more money than she'd seen in one place her entire life. Her father's congregation had been poor but generous, contributing what they could to support their preacher's family, but luxuries had been scarce. James had been a good provider, but their savings had gone toward the westward journey and the dream of Montana land. She should have stepped back, admitted defeat, walked away from this madness before it consumed what little remained of her resources. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Elias Kane had looked at that distant point beyond the crowd, and she understood that he was already planning his death. Not suicide, that would require more emotional energy than he seemed to possess, but simply the gradual surrender that came when life became too heavy to carry. Margaret had felt that weight herself during the worst days of her grief. She knew the seductive pull of simply letting go, of allowing the world to wash over her like a tide that would carry away all pain and responsibility. Only the life growing inside her had anchored her to the world of the living, given her a reason to keep drawing breath when breathing hurt. Looking at Elias Kane, she saw a man who'd lost his anchor and was drifting toward darkness. Something in her pastor's daughter heart rebelled against the waste of it, the terrible injustice of watching a human soul extinguished for the entertainment of a crowd. 250, she said, and her voice carried across the square with surprising strength. The scarred man's amusement faded, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. He studied Margaret with the calculated attention of a predator evaluating prey, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her worn clothing, the way she stood alone in a crowd of strangers. "You got that kind of money, lady?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of threat that made several people in the crowd step back. Margaret lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of her father's pulpit authority. "I wouldn't have bid it if I didn't have it." It was a lie, of course. She had $17 and the growing certainty that she just committed herself to a course of action that would likely end in disaster for both herself and her unborn child. But something in Elias Kane's posture had shifted when he heard her voice, a slight straightening of the shoulders, a barely perceptible turn of the head in her direction. For the first time since taking the platform, he seemed to be truly present, truly aware of what was happening around him. The scarred man took a step toward her, and Margaret felt her hand move instinctively to the rifle slung across her shoulder. The weapon was loaded. She'd learned to keep it that way during the long journey west, and while she'd never shot a man, she'd dropped enough game to know her way around the business end of a firearm. 300, the man said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The words hit her like a physical blow. $300 was impossible, beyond impossible. It was the price of a good horse, a year's wages for a working man, more money than most people in Bitter Creek would see in a lifetime. The auctioneer was practically vibrating with excitement, sensing a windfall that would provide stories for years to come. Margaret felt the fight drain out of her as suddenly as it had appeared. She'd made a noble gesture, but nobility didn't put food on the table or provide shelter for a pregnant woman in hostile territory. Reality reasserted itself with crushing weight, and she prepared to step back and accept defeat. Then Elias Kane spoke for the first time since taking the platform. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness, "you don't need to do this." 4 words, spoken with a gentleness that seemed impossible given his circumstances. Margaret looked up at him and saw something that hadn't been there before. Hope, fragile as a candle flame in winter wind, but unmistakably present. He was telling her she didn't need to save him, but his eyes were saying something entirely different. His eyes were saying, "Please." Margaret thought about James, about the dreams they'd shared, and the promise she'd made at his graveside. She thought about the baby moving restlessly inside her, the child who would need to learn about courage and compassion in a world that seemed determined to crush both. She thought about her father's sermons, about the Good Samaritan, about the obligation to help strangers in distress, regardless of personal cost. Most of all, she thought about the look in Elias Kane's eyes, the same look she'd seen in her own reflection during the darkest days of her grief, the look of someone who'd forgotten that tomorrow might be different from today. $400, she said, and her voice carried across the square like a gunshot. The scarred man's face went rigid with rage. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, sensing that something had shifted, that this was no longer just another auction, but a confrontation between forces they didn't fully understand. The auctioneer looked from Margaret to the scarred man and back again, calculating odds and potential profits with the speed of a professional gambler. $450, the scarred man growled. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible. Choices pressing down on her like physical force. She had $17 and a baby due in 3 months, and a journey that was far from over. What she was contemplating was madness, a gesture so impractical and self-destructive that it bordered on suicide. But when she opened her eyes and looked at Elias Kane, she saw something that changed everything. He was looking directly at her now, and his face held an expression she recognized, the same look James had worn when he'd asked her to marry him, the same mixture of hope and terror that came with reaching for something that might save you or destroy you. $500, she said, and her voice was steady as a rock. The scarred man stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been respect. Finally, he shook his head and stepped back. "Lady's crazy," he muttered loud enough for the crowd to hear, "paying that kind of money for damaged goods." The auctioneer called for additional bids, but the crowd had fallen silent. $500 was beyond the reach of most of the men present, and those who could afford it seemed disinclined to compete with a woman who demonstrated such determined recklessness. After the prescribed waiting period, the hammer fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the square. Sold to the lady for $500. Margaret felt her knees buckle slightly, but managed to remain upright through sheer force of will. She'd just committed herself to paying a sum she didn't possess for a man she didn't know, in front of a crowd that was already beginning to eye her with the speculative interest of predators who'd spotted wounded prey. As the auctioneer's assistant began the process of transferring ownership, Margaret caught Elias Kane's eye one more time. He mouthed a single word, "Why?" and she found herself without an adequate answer. Why indeed? Why risk everything for a stranger? Why throw away her child's future on a gesture that might accomplish nothing more than postponing the inevitable? The answer, when it came to her, was simpler than she'd expected. She'd saved Elias Kane for the same reason she'd buried her husband with her bare hands, the same reason she'd set out west with nothing but faith and determination. Because some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. Because the alternative, walking away and letting darkness win, was unthinkable. As they led Elias Kane down from the platform, his shackles clanking with each step, Margaret began to understand the true magnitude of what she'd done. She'd bought herself a companion for the journey ahead, but she'd also made enemies in a town where enemies could be fatal. The scarred man was watching her with undisguised hostility, and she could see others in the crowd calculating their own opportunities. But when Elias Kane passed close enough to speak to her quietly, his words made all the risks worthwhile. "Thank you," he said simply. "I thought I was finished." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, the first glimmer of a man who might want to live again. It wasn't much, barely more than a spark, but it was enough to kindle hope in her own weary heart. "We're not finished," she told him quietly. "Not yet." As the crowd began to disperse and the harsh reality of her situation settled over her like a cold wind, Margaret realized that her real journey was just beginning. She'd saved Elias Kane from the auction block, but now she had to figure out how to save them both from everything that would follow. The reality of what Margaret had done crashed over her like a winter avalanche as the auctioneer's assistant approached with a ledger and an expectant expression. $500. The sum echoed in her mind with the relentless rhythm of a funeral bell, each repetition driving home the impossibility of her situation. "Payments due now, ma'am," the assistant said, his voice carrying the practiced indifference of someone accustomed to dealing with desperate people. "Cash only." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her coat, where $17 represented the sum total of her worldly wealth. Around her, the crowd had begun to take notice of her hesitation, their faces shifting from mild curiosity to impredatory interest. She could feel their eyes cataloguing her obvious pregnancy, her worn traveling clothes, the way her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her purse. "There seems to be a problem," the scarred man said from somewhere behind her, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "Maybe the lady ain't as flush as she pretended to be." The murmur that rippled through the crowd held an ugly edge. Margaret had seen this before on the trail, the way desperation could transform ordinary people into something resembling wolves. In a place like Bitter Creek, where survival often depended on exploiting others' weaknesses, her predicament represented opportunity. Elias Kane stood 10 feet away, still shackled, watching the scene unfold with an expression that had shifted. From hope to resigned understanding, he'd recognized the truth before she'd even opened her purse, that her bid had been born of impulse rather than resources. Now he waited with the patience of a man who'd grown accustomed to disappointment. "I need a moment," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "To arrange payment," the auctioneer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Lady, this ain't a bank. You bid $500, you pay $500, or the sale gets cancelled and your cowboy goes to the next highest bidder." The scarred man stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Margaret whole. "That would be me," he said conversationally, "and my offer just went down to $250, seeing as how this little show wasted my time." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her, but something in Elias Kane's posture caught her attention. He'd straightened slightly, his eyes moving between her and the surrounding crowd with the calculating attention of a man assessing tactical situations. Whatever had broken him wasn't complete. Somewhere beneath the resignation and despair, the cowboy was still there. "What exactly did I buy?" she asked the auctioneer, stalling for time while her mind raced through rapidly dwindling options. "Standard indenture contract," the man replied, producing a document from his coat pocket. "Gives you legal ownership of his labor for a period of 7 years, transferable upon sale or inheritance. He works, you feed him. Simple as that." Margaret scanned the contract quickly, her education serving her well in deciphering the legal language. What she read made her stomach clench with fresh outrage. The document was more than a labor agreement. It was a blueprint for systematic dehumanization, stripping away every right and dignity that separated human beings from livestock. "This says he can be sold again at any time," she observed. "That's right. Most folks use them for a few months, then trade up for something younger, like horses. You work 'em hard, then pass 'em along before they break down completely." The casual cruelty in his voice sparked something fierce and protective in Margaret's chest. She'd grown up listening to her father's sermons about the inherent worth of every human soul, had been taught that slavery was an abomination that stained the conscience of any nation that tolerated it. Yet here she stood in American territory, witnessing its continuation under a different name. "And if I were to immediately grant him his freedom?" she asked. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. "Contracts binding for the full term unless the debts are paid in full, $500 plus interest and handling fees. You want to free him today, it'll cost you $600. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain upright. $600 was beyond impossible. It was fantasy, fairy tale money that existed only in the dreams of desperate people. Yet as she looked at Elias Kane, she saw something that made her next decision inevitable. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from her own mirror during the darkest days of her grief. Not hope. Hope was too dangerous for someone in his position, but something smaller and more fragile. Curiosity, perhaps. The faint possibility that this moment might be different from all the others that had led him to the auction block. "I'll need time to secure the funds," Margaret said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "How long do I have?" "Payments due before sundown," the auctioneer replied. "Otherwise, the sale's voided and he goes to the backup bidder." Sundown was perhaps 3 hours away. 3 hours to find $600 in a town where she knew no one and had nothing to sell except her father's Bible and her late husband's rifle. The mathematics of survival had never been more starkly impossible. But as Margaret stood there calculating hopeless odds, a memory surfaced from her childhood. Her father standing in the pulpit, speaking about faith the size of mustard seeds, and mountains that could be moved by pure belief. She'd been 8 years old and struggling with arithmetic, convinced that some problems simply had no solutions. "Every problem has an answer," he'd told her later, sitting beside her bed as she wrestled with homework that seemed impossibly complex. "Sometimes the answer isn't what we expect, but it's always there if we're brave enough to look for it." Margaret looked at Elias Kane and saw her answer, not in the form of money she didn't have, but in the recognition that some problems required solutions that existed outside conventional thinking. "I accept the terms," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the square. "But I want to inspect my purchase before completing payment." The auctioneer shrugged, apparently accustomed to the eccentric demands of buyers. He gestured to his assistant, who approached Elias with a key to his shackles. "Go ahead, lady, kick the tires all you want." Margaret walked toward Elias Kane, acutely aware of the crowd's attention focused on her every move. Up close, she could see details that had been invisible from a distance, the careful way he held himself despite obvious pain, the intelligence in his eyes that no amount of hardship had been able to extinguish, the way his hands had been scraped raw from his shackles. "What's your full name?" she asked quietly, pretending to examine him while actually positioning herself so they could speak without being overheard. "Elias Kane," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "But I reckon you already knew that. Where are you from originally?" "Paradise Valley, about 60 miles north of here. Had a ranch there until—" His voice trailed off, and Margaret saw pain flicker across his features like shadow passing over water. "Can you ride?" she asked, her tone casual despite the urgency of her questions. Something shifted in his expression, the first glimmer of genuine curiosity she'd seen. "Yes, ma'am. Born to it." "Good." Margaret stepped closer, pretending to examine his hands while speaking in barely audible whispers. "Listen carefully. I don't have $500. I don't have $50, but I have $17. A rifle, and a plan that might get us both out of this alive." Elias Kane's eyes widened slightly, but his expression remained neutral. Years of surviving impossible situations had taught him to school his reactions, to reveal nothing that might be used against him later. "I'm listening," he murmured. "The stable's behind the saloon. There are horses there. I saw them when I arrived. Can you handle yourself in a fight if it comes to that?" "Depends on the fight," he replied carefully. "Been a while since I had much reason to try." Margaret met his gaze directly, seeing the man he'd been beneath the brokenness that circumstances had imposed upon him. "I'm going to give you a reason." Before he could respond, she raised her voice to address the auctioneer. "He'll do," she announced, "but I want the transaction completed at the bank. I don't carry that kind of money on my person in a place like this." The lie came easily, delivered with the conviction born of absolute necessity. The auctioneer nodded approvingly. Apparently this was a reasonable precaution in his experience. "Banks closed until morning," he replied, "but Jeremiah Stone handles private transactions after hours." He gestured toward a building that looked more like a fortress than a financial institution. He'll charge extra for the service, but he's got the only safe in town. Margaret nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected. Then we'll conclude our business there. In the meantime, I assume my property remains in my custody. Long as the money's good, the auctioneer agreed. But any funny business and the deal's off. As the crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the lack of immediate drama, Margaret found herself alone with Elias Kane for the first time. The assistant had removed his shackles, but she could see the way he held himself, ready to run or fight, depending on which option presented itself first. "You realize you just bought yourself a world of trouble," he said quietly, flexing his wrists where the iron had chafed them raw. "I've been in trouble since the day I was born," Margaret replied. "This is just a different variety. I'm not what you think I am," Elias continued, his voice carrying a weight of confession. "Whatever made you bid on me, whatever you think, you're saving. It's not worth $600. It's not worth 6 cents. Margaret studied his face, seeing the self-loathing that had taken root there like poison oak, choking out everything else. "What happened to you?" she asked simply. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He'd expected judgment, perhaps, or demands for gratitude. He hadn't expected genuine curiosity about his humanity. "Lost everything," he said, after a long moment. "Ranch, family, reason for living, made some bad choices, trusted the wrong people, ended up here." "Family?" Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her own child shifted restlessly. "Wife and daughter," Elias said, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Killed when they came to take the ranch. I wasn't there. Was in town trying to negotiate with the bank. By the time I got home..." He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Margaret felt her heart break a little more. Here was the source of his despair, the weight that had crushed his spirit and left him vulnerable to predators like the men who'd brought him to auction. He wasn't just a victim of an unjust system. He was a man drowning in guilt and grief, convinced that his failures had cost the people he loved most their lives. "How long ago?" she asked gently. 8 months, Elias replied. "Been running ever since, but there's nowhere to run to. Eventually they catch up with you, and then..." He gestured toward the auction platform with bitter irony. Margaret understood. Now why he'd seemed so resigned on the platform, why her rescue attempt had surprised him. He'd been ready to disappear into whatever fate awaited him because he no longer believed he deserved better. In his mind, losing his family had been divine justice for his failures as a husband and father. "Mr. Kane," she said formally, extending her hand as if they were meeting at a church social rather than planning an escape from human traffickers. "My name is Margaret Caldwell, and I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance." He stared at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it with careful gentleness. "Mrs. Caldwell," he replied, and she heard something in his voice that hadn't been there before, the ghost of the man he'd once been, polite and considerate despite his circumstances. "Now then," Margaret continued briskly, as if they were discussing travel arrangements rather than planning a crime, "I believe you mentioned something about horses." For the first time since she'd seen him, Elias Kane's mouth curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I did." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the town square, Margaret felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced since James's death, the thrill of hope combined with purpose. She'd set out west seeking a new beginning, but she'd found something better, a cause worth fighting for and a man worth saving. The baby kicked sharply as if agreeing with her assessment, and Margaret placed her hand over the movement with renewed determination. Her child would not be born into a world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, not if she had anything to say about it. "Mrs. Caldwell," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret looked around the town square, taking in the gallows, the auction platform, the faces of people who'd grown comfortable with cruelty. Then she looked at Elias Kane and saw not a broken man, but someone who might yet remember how to fight for something worthwhile. "Mr. Kane," she said with quiet conviction, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The die was cast. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a pregnant widow and a broken cowboy against a world that had forgotten the value of human dignity. The odds were impossible, but Margaret had learned that impossible was just another word for situations that required faith, courage, and a willingness to risk everything for what was right. The next 2 hours unfolded with the careful precision of a chess game played against an opponent who held every advantage. Margaret and Elias moved through Bitter Creek like actors in a carefully rehearsed performance, each gesture calculated to maintain the illusion that they were simply completing a mundane business transaction rather than planning an escape that could cost them their lives. Margaret's first stop was the general store, where she used 8 of her precious $17 to purchase supplies that would serve double duty, items that appeared to be provisions for keeping an indentured worker, but which would actually sustain them during their flight into the wilderness. Beans, hardtack, coffee, and a small bag of salt joined her existing supplies, while the storekeeper eyed Elias with the casual indifference reserved for livestock. "You'll want to keep him chained at night," the man advised, wrapping her purchases in brown paper. "They get ideas sometimes, especially the ones that had property before, think they're too good for honest work." Margaret nodded gravely, playing her role while Elias stood silently beside her, his face a mask of resigned acceptance. But she caught the slight tightening around his eyes at the storekeeper's words, the barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders. Beneath the surface compliance, anger was stirring, and anger, she was beginning to understand, might be exactly what they needed. "Do you have rope?" she asked, loud enough for other customers to hear. "Something sturdy?" the storekeeper produced, a coil of hemp rope, testing its strength with practiced hands. "This'll hold a bull," he assured her. 50 feet, good quality. Cost you another $1. Margaret paid without haggling, knowing that every transaction was being observed and evaluated by people who'd grown expert at detecting deception. The rope would serve its stated purpose, but not in the way the storekeeper imagined. Instead of binding Elias, it would help them navigate the rocky terrain between Bitter Creek and freedom. Their next stop was the livery stable, where Margaret's heart sank at the sight of the horses available for purchase or rent. Most were broken-down nags, suitable only for pulling wagons, their ribs showing through dull coats and their eyes holding the defeated expression of animals who'd given up hope of better treatment. But in the back stall, she spotted something that made her pulse quicken, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes and the kind of muscular build that suggested both speed and endurance. "That one's not for sale," the stable owner said, following. Her gaze belongs to Marshal Tucker. He's particular about his horses. Margaret felt Elias tense beside her at the mention of the marshal's name, but his expression remained neutral. "What about those two?" she asked, pointing to a pair of geldings that looked reasonably healthy despite their circumstances. $40 each, the owner replied. "Plus tack, that's another 20. You want both? I'll make it an even 100. The sum was impossible given her resources, but Margaret nodded as if considering the offer. "I'll need to discuss it with my banker," she said smoothly. "In the meantime, could you have them ready? I may want to complete the purchase this evening." As they left the stable, Elias spoke quietly without moving his lips, a skill that suggested he'd had previous experience with dangerous conversations. "The mare belongs to Tucker, but he's out of town until tomorrow. Deputy's too drunk most nights to notice if she goes missing until morning." "You know this how?" Margaret asked, matching his technique. "Been watching this place for 3 days before they caught me. Learned the routines." His voice carried a note of self-recrimination. "Should have learned them better," Margaret filed this information away while maintaining her casual pace through the town's main street. Elias's capture hadn't been random bad luck. He'd been conducting surveillance, planning something before circumstances had overtaken him. The knowledge That he possessed tactical skills beyond simple ranch work was both reassuring and troubling. It suggested capabilities that might prove useful in their escape, but it also raised questions about what had brought him to Bitter Creek in the first place. Their performance continued as they visited the hotel, where Margaret inquired about rooms for the night, and the bank, where she spoke with a clerk about transfer procedures for large sums. Each conversation was conducted within earshot of interested observers, building the fiction that she was a legitimate buyer with access to significant funds. The lies came easier with practice, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd grown up watching her father command attention from a pulpit. But as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Margaret felt the weight of their situation pressing down with increasing urgency. They had perhaps an hour before suspicions would begin to solidify into action, and their escape plan remained dangerously incomplete. Stealing horses was one thing. Doing it while pregnant and accompanied by a man who remained largely unknown to her was quite another. "We need to talk," she told Elias, as they paused beside the town's single water trough. "Properly." He glanced around the square, evaluating the positions of various townspeople, with the automatic awareness of someone accustomed to danger. "There's an alley behind the blacksmith's shop," he said quietly. "No windows facing it, and the smith's gone home for supper." They made their way there separately, Margaret stopping to examine the blacksmith's posted prices, while Elias wandered past with the aimless gait of someone with nowhere particular to go. The alley proved to be exactly what he'd promised. A narrow space between buildings where they could speak without being observed, though the constant background noise of the saloon meant they still needed to keep their voices low. "Before we go any further," Margaret said without preamble, "I need to know what I'm getting myself into. Who are you really? And why were you watching the stable?" Elias leaned against the rough wooden wall, his face half hidden in shadow. For a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, but then he began to speak with the careful cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation many times in his own mind. "I told you true about my family," he said. "Wife Sarah, daughter Emma. They were killed when Bartholomew Grant's men came to take my ranch. But what I didn't tell you is that Grant didn't just want my land. He wanted me gone because I'd been asking questions about his other business interests." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that get you labeled a troublemaker in a place where—" "Troublemakers don't live long." Elias's voice carried a bitter edge. "Grant owns half the judges in the territory, has his fingers in everything from mining claims to cattle rustling. My ranch sat on a silver vein worth more than the entire town. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to make sure no one else ever figured out what was buried there. Margaret absorbed this information while calculating its implications for their escape. If Elias was telling the truth, they weren't just fleeing human traffickers. They were running from someone with the resources and connections to pursue them across the entire territory. The odds, already impossible, had just gotten significantly worse. "So what were you planning to do here?" she asked. "Before they caught you?" "Stupid thing," Elias admitted. "I thought if I could gather enough evidence about Grant's operation, the auctions, the forced labor, the corruption, I might be able to interest a federal marshal in taking action. Figured if I could bring him down, maybe I could get some kind of justice for Sarah and Emma." Margaret studied his face in the dim light, seeing the idealism that had survived despite everything he'd endured. It was the same impulse that had driven her father to preach against injustice, even when it cost him parishioners, the same conviction that had led her to bid on a stranger's freedom despite lacking the resources to pay for it. "But they caught you first," she observed. 3 days ago. I got careless, stayed too long in one place. Grant's men dragged me straight to the sheriff, who handed me over to the auction without even pretending to care about due process." Elias laughed bitterly. "Turns out evidence gathering is harder when you're the one being sold." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Elias hadn't been captured randomly. He'd been betrayed by the very system he'd hoped to use against Grant. The sheriff, the auctioneer, probably half the town were part of a network that had been operating with impunity for years. Her rescue attempt hadn't just saved one man from slavery, it had inadvertently declared war on the entire corrupt structure. "How far does Grant's influence reach?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Far enough," Elias replied grimly. "He's got people in every town between here and the Canadian border. Money talks, and fear talks louder. Most folks would rather look the other way than risk ending up on an auction block themselves." The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if reacting to the tension in Margaret's voice. She placed her hand over the movement, thinking about the world she was trying to bring her child into, a world where corruption had become so normalized that decent people had stopped expecting justice. "There's something else," Elias continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The reason Grant's operation works so well is because he's got federal protection. Someone in Washington is making sure no investigations get too close to the truth." Margaret felt her heart sink even further. Federal corruption meant their problems extended far beyond territorial boundaries. Even if they managed to escape bitter Greek, they'd be running from an enemy with resources and reach they could barely comprehend. "So what do you suggest we do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. When he spoke, his words carried a weight of decision that seemed to surprise him as much as her. "We run," he said simply. "We get out of here tonight, and we keep running until we find somewhere they can't follow. It's not justice, but it's survival. And maybe survival's enough for now." Margaret thought about her father's sermons, about the obligation to fight injustice, even when the cost seemed unbearable. Then she thought about her unborn child, about the life growing inside her that deserved a chance to see better days. Sometimes survival wasn't surrender. Sometimes it was the first step toward eventual victory. "All right," she said, extending her hand once again. "Partners?" Elias took her hand, and this time his grip was firm and confident. "Partners," he agreed. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much good at the staying alive part lately." Margaret smiled despite their circumstances. "Then it's fortunate that I'm very good at stubborn." As they shook hands in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt something shift between them, the beginning of trust, born from shared desperation and mutual respect. They were still strangers in many ways, but they were strangers who'd chosen to stand together against impossible odds. It wasn't much, but it was a foundation on which something stronger might eventually be built. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Margaret of better days. Soon it would be time to put their desperate plan into motion, to risk everything on the hope that freedom lay somewhere beyond the horizon. But for this moment, standing in an alley with a man she'd known for mere hours, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death, the sense that she wasn't facing the future alone. The escape began at sunset, with Margaret walking calmly toward the saloon, while Elias made his way to the livery stable through a route that kept him in the shadows of buildings and away from curious eyes. They'd agreed on a simple plan born of necessity rather than sophistication: steal 2 horses and ride hard toward the mountains before anyone noticed their absence. The simplicity was both strength and weakness, while it offered fewer opportunities for complicated failures. It also provided little margin for error if something went wrong. Margaret's role was to create a distraction that would draw attention away from the stable, while Elias prepared their mounts. She'd chosen the saloon for this purpose, calculating that the establishment's usual evening chaos would provide perfect cover for whatever commotion she might cause. The baby had been kicking restlessly all afternoon, as if sensing the tension radiating from its mother, but now it seemed to settle into watchful stillness. The saloon's interior was exactly what she'd expected, a cloud of tobacco smoke so thick it made her eyes water, the sharp smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies, and the kind of raucous laughter that usually accompanied activities her father would have condemned from the pulpit. Pearl, the hollow-eyed woman who'd rented her the storage room, looked up from behind the bar with surprise at seeing a respectable woman enter her establishment voluntarily. "You lost, honey?" Pearl asked, her voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd been breathing smoke and shouting over noise for too many years. "Not lost," Margaret replied, raising her voice to carry over the din. "Looking for information about my recent purchase." The word purchase had an immediate effect on the saloon's patrons. Conversations died as heads turned toward her, and Margaret found herself the center of attention in a way that made her skin crawl. These were the same men who'd watched the auction with casual interest, who'd bid on human beings like they were, purchasing livestock for their farms. "The cowboy?" Pearl asked, her expression shifting to one of professional interest. "Heard you paid quite a premium for that one. Hope he's worth it." Margaret forced herself to smile as if she was discussing the weather rather than human slavery. "That's what I'm trying to determine. I've heard conflicting reports about his capabilities. Thought perhaps some of the gentlemen here might have personal experience with similar acquisitions." The lie rolled off her tongue with disturbing ease, but it achieved its intended purpose. Several men approached the bar, eager to share their expertise on the subject of forced labor and the relative merits of different types of workers. Margaret listened with growing revulsion while maintaining an expression of polite interest, playing the role of a naive woman seeking guidance from more experienced buyers. "Ranchers are tricky," offered a man whose breath smelled like he'd been drinking since noon. "They think they're too good for real work, what with having owned property and all. Need to break that spirit early if you want useful labor out of them." "How does one go about that?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the urge to reach for her rifle. "Whip helps," another man suggested with casual cruelty. "Few lashes. When they get uppity, they remember their place quick enough. Course, you being a lady and all, might want to hire someone else to handle the discipline part." Margaret nodded thoughtfully, while calculating how long Elias would need to ready their horses. Through the saloon's grimy window, she could see the stable in the distance, its interior lit by a single lantern, no signs of unusual activity yet, which she hoped meant their plan was proceeding smoothly. "What about escape attempts?" she asked, knowing the question would generate the kind of animated discussion that would keep everyone's attention focused on her rather than the stable. "I imagine that's always a concern with the more intelligent ones." The question sparked exactly the response she'd hoped for. Men began sharing stories of past escapes, failed and successful, each tale more elaborate than the last. Margaret learned more than she ever wanted to know about tracking techniques, punishment methods, and the informal network that existed to recapture runaway workers. The information was valuable, but it also painted a picture of systematic brutality that made her feel physically ill. "Course the smart ones don't usually try running," the drunk man observed. "They know there's nowhere to go, territory's too big, and most folks will turn them in for the reward money." "Reward money?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. $20 for returning runaway workers to their owners, Pearl explained. Posted by the territorial government. Makes it real attractive for folks to keep their eyes open. $20 was more than most people in the territory saw in a month. Margaret realized with growing dread that even if they managed to escape Bitter Creek, they'd be running through a landscape where every stranger was a potential bounty hunter. The baby kicked sharply, as if reacting to her spike of anxiety. "Excuse me," she said, placing her hand over her belly. "The baby's been restless all day. I think I need some air." The gesture had the intended effect, reminding everyone present of her condition and providing a plausible excuse for her to step outside. Men who'd been eager to discuss the finer points of human subjugation suddenly became uncomfortable with the presence of a pregnant woman, their faces shifting to expressions of awkward politeness. Margaret made her way toward the door with what She hoped appeared to be the careful gait of an expectant mother rather than the urgent pace of someone executing an escape plan. Behind her, the conversation resumed with its previous volume. The men, apparently satisfied that she'd been appropriately educated about the realities of owning forced labor. The evening air felt clean and cold after the suffocating atmosphere. Of the saloon, Margaret took several deep breaths while scanning the stable for signs of Elias. A shadow moved briefly past the lantern light, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But a moment later, she heard the soft nickering of horses being soothed by gentle hands, the sound of someone who understood animals and knew how to calm them. Margaret began walking toward the stable with measured steps, fighting every instinct that urged her to run. The town square was largely empty now, most residents having retreated indoors for their evening meals, but she could see lights in windows and the occasional silhouette of someone moving past uncurtained glass. Any unusual activity would be noticed and remembered, potentially providing crucial information to pursuers who would inevitably follow. As she reached the stable's entrance, Elias materialized from the shadows like a ghost, leading two saddled horses with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent his life around animals. The mare he'd mentioned, Marshal Tucker's horse, stood calmly beside a sturdy gelding, both animals alert but unafraid. "Any problems?" Margaret whispered. "None yet," Elias replied, his voice barely audible. "But we need to move now. The deputy makes his rounds in about 10 minutes, and if he sees these horses missing—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood that discovery meant death, or worse, a return to the auction block for Elias and whatever fate awaited. Pregnant women who aided escaped workers. The baby seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, remaining perfectly still as Margaret approached the gelding Elias had selected for her. "Can you mount without help?" he asked, clearly concerned about her condition. "I've been riding since I was 6 years old," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. The truth was, mounting a horse while 7 months pregnant was considerably different from the riding she'd done as a child, but she managed to settle into the saddle with only minor difficulty. The gelding accepted her weight with patient calm, apparently accustomed to carrying riders of various sizes and skill levels. Elias swung onto the mare with fluid grace, his body moving with the automatic ease of someone who'd been born to horseback. For the first time since she'd seen him on the auction platform, he looked entirely natural, a cowboy in his proper element rather than a broken man accepting his fate. "Where are we headed?" Margaret asked as they walked their horses quietly. "Toward the edge of town. North toward the mountains," Elias replied. "There's an old mining trail that'll get us away from the main roads. It's rough going, but it's our best chance of avoiding immediate pursuit." Margaret nodded, though privately she wondered how rough going would affect both her pregnancy and their stolen horses. The mare beneath Elias was clearly a quality animal, bred for speed and endurance, but her own mount was more workmanlike, sturdy and reliable, but not built for extended flight across difficult terrain. They reached the edge of Bitter Creek without incident, the town's lights falling away behind them as they entered the vast darkness of the Montana wilderness. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the trail ahead while casting everything else in shades of silver and shadow. Margaret had never felt so small or so exposed, a tiny figure on horseback in a landscape that stretched endlessly. "In all directions. How far to the mining trail?" she asked, raising her voice slightly to carry over the sound of their horses' hooves on hard-packed earth. "About an hour at this pace," Elias replied. "Once we reach it, we can push harder. The trail's too narrow for wagons, so they won't be able to follow with a large group." The knowledge was comforting, but Margaret understood that their real challenges lay ahead rather than behind. They had no supplies beyond what she'd purchased that afternoon, no destination beyond "away from here," and no plan for what would happen when their horses needed rest or their own strength gave out. The baby was due in approximately 2 months, and the thought of giving birth in the wilderness with only a stranger for assistance was terrifying beyond description. But as they rode through the darkness, with their stolen horses carrying them toward an uncertain future, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death, the exhilaration of taking action rather than simply enduring whatever fate handed her. She was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was a woman making choices, however desperate, to shape her own destiny. Elias rode beside her with quiet competence, his attention constantly moving between the trail ahead and the landscape around them. Margaret found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, noting the way tension had left his shoulders for the first time since she'd seen him. Whatever demons haunted him, they seemed to lose some of their power when he was doing something, active rather than simply surviving. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "For what?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "For giving me a reason to fight again," Elias replied simply. "I'd forgotten what that felt like." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from emotion or the cold wind she couldn't say. "We're not safe yet," she warned. "No," Elias agreed, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope, "but we're not finished either." Behind them, Bitter Creek continued its nightly business, unaware that 2 of its temporary residents had vanished into the darkness. But Margaret knew their absence would be discovered soon enough, and when it was, the real chase would begin. For now, though, they were free. 2 broken people who'd chosen to trust each other enough to risk everything on the possibility that somewhere ahead lay something better than what they were leaving behind. 3 days into their flight, Margaret discovered that the romance novel she'd read as a young woman had woefully misrepresented the realities of life on the run. There was nothing romantic about waking before dawn with frost in her hair, nothing adventurous about riding pregnant through terrain that seemed designed to challenge every muscle in her body. The baby had grown increasingly restless, as if protesting its mother's sudden change in lifestyle, and Margaret found herself speaking to it in whispered reassurances that she wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. "We'll find somewhere safe soon," she murmured, one hand on her belly while the other held her gelding's reins. "Your papa would have liked this country, I think. All this open space, these mountains that touch the sky." Elias rode slightly ahead, his attention constantly moving between the narrow trail they followed and the vast landscape that surrounded them. The mining road had proven to be everything he'd promised. Rough, isolated, and blessedly free of other travelers. But it was also taking them deeper into wilderness that grew more forbidding with each mile, and Margaret was beginning to understand that escape was only the first of their challenges. They'd rationed their supplies carefully, but the food she'd purchased in Bitter Creek was running low. Elias had managed to shoot a rabbit on their second day, but hunting while maintaining their pace was proving difficult, and Margaret worried about what would happen when their luck ran out. The thought of her unborn child going hungry was more terrifying than any physical danger they might face. "There's water ahead," Elias called back to her, his voice carrying a note of relief. "We can rest the horses and refill our canteens." The stream they found was crystal clear and cold enough to make Margaret's teeth ache when she cupped it in her hands to drink. But it was clean water, and after 3 days of careful rationing, she allowed herself the luxury of drinking her fill before settling beside it to rest. The baby responded to the water with vigorous kicks, as if celebrating its mother's improved hydration. Elias knelt upstream from her, filling their canteens with methodical efficiency before letting the horses drink their fill. Margaret watched him work, noting the way he moved with unconscious grace despite the hardships of their journey. The broken man she'd seen on the auction platform was still there beneath the surface, but each day of purposeful action seemed to restore a little more of who he'd been before grief and guilt had nearly destroyed him. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, surprising herself with the request. They'd spoken little during their flight, conversation being a luxury when survival demanded constant vigilance. Elias paused in his work, his hands stilling on the canteen he'd been filling. For a moment, Margaret thought he might refuse to answer. But then he began to speak, with the careful cadence of someone handling precious but painful memories. "Paradise Valley," he said, settling beside the stream but maintaining enough distance to respect her modesty. "Prettiest place you ever saw, with grass so green it hurt your eyes and mountains that changed color with the time of day. Had about 1,000 acres, good water rights, and a house that Sarah helped me build board by board." His voice carried a warmth that Margaret hadn't heard before, the echo of a man who'd once been deeply happy. "How long were you there?" 5 years, Elias replied. "We started with nothing but dreams and determination. I worked other ranches during the day to earn money for supplies, and Sarah tended our small herd and planted vegetables. Emma was born. In that house, in the bedroom that looked out over the valley, Sarah said she wanted her first sight of the world to be something beautiful." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Elias agreed simply. "Could outride most men, could shoot better than most, and could make the worst day better just by smiling." Emma had her mother's smile, wide and bright enough to light up a room. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the wounds were fresh rather than months old. Margaret understood that kind of grief, the way it could ambush you at unexpected moments and leave you gasping like you'd been punched in the stomach. "James used to talk about building something lasting," she said softly. "Not just for us, but for the children we hoped to have. He'd describe the house we'd build, the fields we'd plant, the legacy we'd leave behind. I think he would have understood your Sarah." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd learned that shared grief could sometimes be less burdensome than grief carried alone. The stream bubbled over rocks worn smooth by countless years of water, and Margaret found herself mesmerized by the sound, constant but never quite the same, like a conversation in a language she almost understood. "What happened?" she asked finally, though she suspected the answer would be painful for both of them. Elias was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the sound of moving water. "Bartholomew. Grant wanted my land," he said, "not just to own it, but to make sure no one else ever figured out what was buried beneath it. Silver, enough to fund a small war. He made offers at first, reasonable ones considering what the ranch was worth on the surface. But I knew there was more to it, knew he wouldn't be offering good money for grazing land unless there was something else there." Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I started asking questions, looking into Grant's other acquisitions, trying to understand what made my property so valuable. That's when I learned about the corruption, the way he'd been using forced labor to work his mines, the deals he'd made with territorial officials to look the other way." "So you tried to expose him," Margaret observed. "I tried," Elias agreed bitterly. "Thought if I could gather enough evidence I could interest an honest marshal in taking action. Spent weeks riding to different towns, talking to people who'd been cheated or threatened, documenting everything I could find. What went wrong?" Elias picked up a smooth stone from beside the stream, turning it over in his hands with absent concentration. "I got careless, started trusting people I shouldn't have trusted, sharing information with folks who turned out to be on Grant's payroll. One day I came home from a trip to find—" His voice broke, and Margaret saw his hands tremble as the memory overwhelmed him. She wanted to reach out, to offer some physical comfort, but didn't know if such a gesture would be welcome. "They were both gone," he whispered. "Sarah and Emma burned the house, scattered the cattle, salted the fields so nothing would grow. Left a message saying this was what happened to troublemakers who didn't know when to mind their own business." Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. The casual cruelty of it, the deliberate destruction of everything Elias had built and loved, was almost incomprehensible. "I'm so sorry," she said. knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. I buried them in the valley they loved, Elias continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Then I spent the next 8 months trying to drink myself to death in every saloon between there and here. When that didn't work, I decided to go after Grant directly. Figured if I couldn't live with what happened, at least I could make sure he paid for it. Is that what brought you to Bitter Creek? Elias nodded. Grant's operation there was bigger than anything I'd seen before. Thought if I could document it properly, maybe find some of his financial records, I could build a case that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore. Margaret understood now why he'd seemed so resigned on the auction platform. He hadn't just lost his family and his ranch. He'd lost his faith in justice itself, his belief that good could triumph over evil through proper channels. The man who'd tried to fight corruption through legal means had been betrayed by the very system he'd hoped to reform. Do you think he knows we escaped? She asked. He'll know soon enough, Elias replied grimly. Grant has people everywhere, and news travels fast when there's money involved. We probably have a day, maybe 2, before organized pursuit begins. The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if reminding Margaret of what was at stake beyond their own survival. She placed both hands over the movement, thinking about the child who would soon need safety, stability, and a future free from the kind of corruption that had destroyed Elias's family. Where can we go? She asked. If his influence reaches across the territory, Canada maybe, Elias suggested, or far enough south that his network thins out. But traveling that far with you in your condition, he gestured toward her obvious pregnancy with delicate concern. Margaret had been thinking the same thing. Every day in the saddle was becoming more difficult, and she estimated they had perhaps 6 weeks before the baby arrived. The thought of giving birth in the wilderness was terrifying. But the alternative, being caught by Grant's men, was worse. There might be another option, Elias said slowly, as if the idea was forming even as he spoke. It's dangerous, probably stupid, but it might work. I'm listening, Margaret replied. What if we stopped running? Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What do you mean? I mean, what if we found a place to make a stand? Somewhere. We could build something worth defending instead of just trying to stay ahead of our pursuers. The idea was radical, but as Margaret considered it, she began to see the logic. Running while pregnant was becoming increasingly difficult, and they had no guarantee that distance would provide safety from someone with Grant's resources. But choosing their ground, preparing for confrontation rather than simply reacting to it, that might give them advantages they currently lacked. Where would we go? She asked. Elias smiled for the first time since she'd known him, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the man he'd been before tragedy had reshaped him. I know a place, he said. Remote enough to be defensible, but with good water and game. It's where I was planning to take Sarah and Emma when we expanded the ranch. Margaret felt something stir in her chest that might have been hope. How far? 2 days hard riding, Elias replied. But if we can make it there, we might be able to build something they can't easily take away. As they prepared to resume their journey, Margaret found herself thinking about James and the dreams they'd shared of building something lasting in the Montana wilderness. Perhaps those dreams weren't as dead as she'd thought. Perhaps it was possible to create something beautiful even in the midst of danger and uncertainty. The baby kicked again, and Margaret smiled as she mounted her horse. Her child would need more than just survival. It would need a reason to believe in the possibility of better days ahead. Maybe, with Elias's help, she could provide both. The place Elias led her to was everything he'd promised and more, a hidden valley nestled between towering pine-covered ridges, with a stream that sang over granite boulders and meadows that stretched like green carpets toward distant peaks. Margaret's first sight of it took her breath away, not just because of its beauty, but because she could instantly understand why someone would fight to protect it. Sarah named it Haven Valley, Elias said quietly, as they sat their horses on the ridge overlooking the meadow. Said it looked like the kind of place God would go when he wanted to rest. Margaret could see why Sarah had chosen that name. The Te Valley felt separate from the harsh realities of the world beyond its borders, a pocket of peace carved from the wilderness by some divine hand. Wild flowers dotted the meadow in splashes of purple and yellow, and she could see deer grazing near the far tree line, unafraid and unhurried. But as beautiful as it was, Margaret couldn't ignore the practical challenges it represented. The valley was accessible by only one narrow trail, which made it defensible but also potentially a trap if they were discovered. There was no existing shelter, no prepared supplies, and winter was perhaps 2 months away. Building something livable before the snow fell would require resources they didn't possess and time they might not have. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "But Elias, how can we possibly make this work? I'm due in 6 weeks. We have no tools, no building materials." "I know," he replied, his voice carrying a determination she'd rarely heard from him. "But I've been thinking about this since we started running. We can't keep going indefinitely, and trying to outrun Grant's reach might be impossible anyway. Here, at least, we'd have advantages." As they descended into the valley, Elias began pointing out features that weren't immediately obvious to Margaret's untrained eye. The stream provided not just water, but potential power for simple machinery. Several stands of timber offered building materials, and the meadow showed signs of having been grazed by wild horses, suggesting abundant grass for their stolen mounts. "There," Elias said, pointing to a slight rise near the center of the valley. "Good drainage, protected from the worst winds, close enough to water but high enough to avoid flooding. That's where we build." Margaret tried to picture a house rising from the empty meadow, tried to imagine herself giving birth somewhere other than the open wilderness. The baby had been quiet during their descent, but now it began moving with what felt like excited energy, as if sensing its mother's cautious optimism. They made camp that first night beside the stream, with Elias insisting that Margaret rest, while he tended the horses and began taking inventory of their situation. The stolen supplies from Bitter Creek were nearly exhausted, but the valley offered immediate resources: clear water, fish in the stream, and signs of game throughout the surrounding forest. "Tomorrow I'll start on shelter," Elias said as they shared their meager supper beside a carefully banked fire. "Nothing fancy at first, just something to keep the weather off. Once we have basic protection, we can think about improvements." Margaret watched his face in the firelight, noting the way purpose had transformed his features. The broken man from the auction platform was still there, but he was being rapidly eclipsed by someone who'd remembered what it felt like to build rather than simply survive. "What about tools?" she asked practically. "Building supplies? There's an abandoned mining camp about 10 miles north of here," Elias replied. "Been empty for 3 years, but there might be tools left behind, maybe some hardware we can salvage. It's risky. Grant's men might be watching it, but it could give us what we need to get started." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the meadow grass like scattered diamonds. Margaret woke to find Elias already up, studying the terrain with the focused attention of someone planning a campaign. The baby stirred restlessly as she sat up, and she placed both hands over the movement with a mixture of wonder and worry. "How are you feeling?" Elias asked, noticing her discomfort. "Heavy," Margaret replied honestly. "And worried about what happens when this baby decides it's time to be born." Elias was quiet for a moment, clearly grappling with the same concerns that kept Margaret awake at night. Neither of them had any experience with childbirth, and the nearest doctor was probably in a town they could never safely enter. "My mother delivered my younger brother without help," he said finally. "Said women had been having babies long before there were doctors to assist them. Nature has a way of managing these things." Margaret appreciated the attempt at reassurance, but she also understood the risks involved in wilderness childbirth. Too many things could go wrong. Too many complications could arise that would require knowledge and skills neither of them possessed. but dwelling on worst-case scenarios wouldn't change their situation. "Then we'd better make sure we have a warm, dry place for it to happen," she said with more confidence than she felt. Over the next week, they threw themselves into the work of building with desperate energy. Elias proved to be remarkably skilled with his hands, able to fashion tools from salvaged materials and construct surprisingly sophisticated structures using techniques he'd learned during his ranching years. Margaret contributed what she could, despite her growing bulk, gathering materials, preparing meals, and offering suggestions based on her own limited experience with domestic construction. The abandoned mining camp yielded treasures beyond their wildest hopes, a complete set of carpentry tools, several coils of rope, nails and hardware that some long-departed miner had left behind, and even a small cast-iron stove that Elias managed to transport back to their valley, using a travois constructed from lodge poles and canvas. But their greatest discovery was a cache of medical supplies that had apparently belonged to the camp's doctor. Laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for disinfection, clean bandages, and even a set of surgical instruments that Margaret hoped they'd never need to use. The supplies were old but still usable, and their presence transformed Margaret's anxiety about the approaching birth into something approaching cautious confidence. As their shelter took shape, a sturdy cabin built from logs and chinked with mud and moss, Margaret found herself falling into a domestic routine that felt both familiar and strange. She'd kept house for James, but that had been in settled country with neighbors and stores within reasonable distance. Here, every meal had to be planned around available resources, every task completed with improvised tools and recycled materials. But there was satisfaction in the work that surprised her. When Elias brought home a deer he'd shot, she found herself expertly butchering the carcass and preparing meat for smoking, drawing on skills her mother had taught her years ago. When their clothes needed mending, she discovered she could work miracles with needle and thread, patching and reinforcing garments to extend their useful life. The baby seemed to approve of their new circumstances, its movements becoming less restless and more rhythmic as Margaret's stress levels decreased. She'd taken to talking to it during quiet moments, describing the valley they were making their home and the father who was working so hard to provide for their uncertain future. "Your papa, James, would have loved this place," she whispered one evening as she sat beside the stream while Elias worked on the cabin's roof. "He dreamed of building something lasting, something that would endure long after we were gone. I think he'd be pleased to know his child will grow up somewhere so beautiful." But even as their immediate circumstances improved, Margaret couldn't shake the awareness that they were living on borrowed time. Grant's reach was long, and their valley, however remote, wouldn't remain secret forever. Sooner or later, their pursuers would find them, and when that happened, all their careful construction might prove to be nothing more than elaborate preparation for a siege they couldn't win. The thought came to her most often during the long evenings when she and Elias sat by their fire, sharing the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to appreciate each other's company. She'd catch him staring into the flames with an expression that suggested his thoughts had traveled to dark places, and she'd wonder if he was thinking about Sarah and Emma, or about the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. "Elias," she said one night, surprising herself with the question that emerged, "do you think we're building something real here, or just postponing the inevitable?" He considered her words carefully before responding, his gaze moving from the fire to the cabin that was nearing completion. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes postponing the inevitable is the same thing as building something real. Every day we spend here is a day we're not running, not looking over our shoulders, not letting fear make our choices for us." Margaret felt the truth of his words settle into her bones like warmth from the fire. They might not be able to predict or control what would happen when Grant's men finally found them, but they could control how they chose to spend the time they had. They could build something worth defending, create something beautiful enough to justify the risks they were taking. The baby kicked strongly, as if agreeing with the conversation, and Margaret smiled as she placed her hand over the movement. Her child would be born in this valley, would take its first breath of mountain air and see its first sunrise over peaks that touched the sky. Whatever happened after that, at least she could give it a beginning that was worthy of the dreams she and James had shared. "Thank you," she said quietly, not sure if she was addressing Elias or the universe in general. "For what?" Elias asked. "For giving me a reason to stop running," Margaret replied, "for helping me remember what it feels like to build something instead of just trying to survive." Elias reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from weeks of hard work. "Thank you for giving me a reason to try again," he said simply. As they sat together in the growing darkness, listening to the stream sing its eternal song and watching stars emerge above the valley rim, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since James's death. The sense that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The future remained uncertain, filled with dangers they could neither predict nor prevent, but the present moment was theirs to shape. The cabin stood half-finished in the meadow behind them, its log walls promising warmth and security for the child who would soon need both. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she set out west, with James's dreams in her heart. But it was a life worth living, worth fighting for, worth the risks they'd taken to claim it. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more preparations to make for the winter and the baby, and whatever challenges lay ahead. But tonight, sitting beside a stream in a hidden valley with a man who'd learned to hope again, Margaret allowed herself to believe that some things really were worth the price they'd paid to find them. The discovery came on a morning when autumn had begun painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, and Margaret's pregnancy had reached the stage where every movement required careful consideration. She'd been hanging laundry near the stream when she noticed something odd about the way sunlight hit the water at a particular bend, a glint that seemed too regular, too purposeful to be natural. "Elias," she called, her voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than alarm. "Come look at this." He emerged from the cabin, where he'd been installing the last of their salvaged windows, wiping his hands on a piece of cloth as he approached. The domestic scene they'd created over the past month felt so normal that it was easy to forget they were fugitives living on borrowed time. "What is it?" he asked, following her gaze toward the stream. "There," Margaret pointed to the spot where water curved around a cluster of boulders. "Do you see how the light catches something in the water? It's not rocks. Rocks don't shine like that." Elias studied the area with the focused attention he brought to everything that might affect their security. Then his expression changed, shifting from mild curiosity to something approaching wonder. "I think," he said slowly, "we may have found something significant." It took them the better part of an hour to extract the object from its resting place among the stream stones. What they pulled from the water was a leather satchel, its contents protected by waxed canvas and careful wrapping. Inside, Margaret found documents that made her heart race. Letters, ledgers, and what appeared to be official correspondence bearing territorial seals. "These are grants papers," Elias said, his voice tight with disbelief as he examined a letter bearing the familiar letterhead. "Financial records, correspondence with government officials. This is everything I was trying to find when they caught me." Margaret spread the documents carefully on a flat rock, her hands trembling slightly as she began to comprehend what they'd discovered. The papers told a story of systematic corruption that reached far beyond anything she'd imagined. Bribes to territorial officials, detailed records of forced labor operations, and most damning of all, correspondence with federal agents who were supposed to be investigating the very crimes they were actually facilitating. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a letter dated just 2 months earlier. "It's from someone in Washington, promising to suppress any federal investigation in exchange for a percentage of Grant's mining profits." Elias read over her shoulder, his breathing becoming shallow as the implications became clear. "This isn't just territorial corruption," he said. This goes all the way to the federal level. Grant's been operating with official protection from the very people who should have been stopping him. But it was the final document in the satchel that changed everything. A detailed confession, written in a familiar hand and signed with a name that made Margaret's blood run cold. "James Caldwell," she whispered, staring at her late husband's signature. "But that's impossible. James died of fever months before I ever heard of Grant or Bitter Creek." Elias took the document from her, shaking hands, reading it with growing amazement. The confession was comprehensive and devastating, detailing Grant's entire operation from the perspective of someone who'd been intimately involved in its planning and execution. It described the systematic exploitation of forced labor, the bribery of territorial officials, and the murder of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. "Your husband wasn't just a farmer," Elias said quietly. "According to this, he was Grant's accountant, the man who kept track of all the money flowing through the operation. This confession, Margaret, this is a complete record of everything. Grant's done, written by someone who was there for all of it." Margaret felt the world shift around her as she absorbed the implications. James, her gentle husband who dreamed of building a homestead in Montana, had been part of the very corruption that had destroyed Elias's family. The man she'd mourned, whose memory had sustained her through months of hardship, had been complicit in crimes that included murder, slavery, and systematic theft. "He was dying," she said, grasping at explanations that might preserve some fragment of the man she'd loved. "The fever, maybe he wanted to confess before. Look at the date." Elias interrupted gently. "This was written a week before his death. He knew he was dying, and he was trying to make things right." Margaret studied the confession again, this time reading it not as an accusation, but as a plea for forgiveness. James had detailed not just the crimes he'd witnessed, but his own growing horror at what he'd become part of. The final paragraphs described his unsuccessful attempts to withdraw from Grant's organization and his growing fear that his association with the operation would eventually destroy his family. He was trying to get out, she realized. That's why we were leaving for Montana, not to claim new land, but to escape from Grant's reach. And Grant couldn't let that happen, Elias added grimly. An accountant knows too much, sees too much. Even a dying accountant represents a threat. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. James's sudden illness, which the doctor had attributed to a particularly virulent fever, began to look less like natural causes and more like deliberate poisoning. Grant hadn't just destroyed Elias's family, he'd destroyed hers as well, using methods subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but effective enough to eliminate a potential threat. "My husband was murdered," Margaret said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Grant killed him to keep him quiet." The revelation reframed everything she thought she knew about her journey west. She hadn't been a widow seeking a new beginning. She'd been a target fleeing an enemy she hadn't even known existed. Her arrival in Bitter Creek hadn't been random misfortune, but the culmination of a plan that had been in motion since before James's death. "The auction," she said suddenly. "Grant knew who I was when I bid on you. He wasn't just selling forced labor, he was waiting for me to reveal myself." Elias nodded grimly. "Which means our escape wasn't as clean as we thought. He's been tracking us, probably since the moment we left town." The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if responding to its mother's surge of adrenaline. Margaret placed both hands over the movement, thinking about the child who would soon be born into a world where its father had been murdered, and its mother was being hunted by the same man who'd destroyed so many other families. But as the initial shock began to fade, Margaret felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not despair, but anger. Clean, purposeful anger that burned away the confusion and self-doubt that had plagued her since James's death. She finally understood what she was fighting against, and more importantly, she finally had the weapons to fight back. "Elias," she said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "These documents don't just prove Grant's guilt. They provide everything we need to destroy his entire operation. Assuming we can get them to someone with the authority and integrity to act on them, Elias replied. And that's a very large assumption, given how deep this corruption goes. Margaret studied the papers again, noting details she'd missed during her initial shock. Names, dates, amounts of money, specific crimes committed against specific people. It was a prosecutor's dream, if they could find a prosecutor who wasn't already in Grant's pocket. What about the territorial marshal in Helena? She suggested. He's appointed by Washington, not elected locally. Grant might not have gotten to him yet. It's possible, Elias agreed cautiously. But Helena's a 3-day ride minimum, and traveling there with you in your condition would be difficult but not impossible, Margaret finished. Especially if we have something worth the risk. As they discussed their options, Margaret found herself thinking about Sarah and Emma Kane, about James and all the other victims of Grant's systematic cruelty. The documents in the satchel represented more than evidence. They were testament to lives destroyed, families scattered, and justice too long delayed. There's something else we need to consider, Elias said quietly. If we do this, if we try to expose Grant using these documents, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing it through, no matter what the cost. Margaret looked around the valley they'd worked so hard to make their home, thinking about the cabin they'd built and the life they'd begun to create together. Then she thought about the baby growing inside her and the world she wanted to bring it into. A world where corruption had consequences and justice was more than just a word. Preachers used in Sunday sermons. Good, she said firmly. I'm tired of running from shadows. It's time to turn on the lights. The decision, once made, felt surprisingly liberating. They spent the rest of the day carefully preserving and hiding copies of the most crucial documents, ensuring that if something happened to the originals, the evidence wouldn't be lost with them. Margaret used skills learned from her father's sermon preparation to create detailed summaries that would help prosecutors understand the scope of Grant's crimes. As evening fell and they sat by their fire, planning the journey to Helena, Margaret felt a profound shift in the nature of their relationship. They were no longer just two broken people helping each other survive. They had become partners in a cause that was larger than either of them individually. Are you sure about this? Elias asked, as they prepared for what might be their last night in the valley they'd grown to love. Once we leave here, once we commit to this course of action, there's no guarantee we'll ever be able to come back. Margaret placed her hand on her belly, feeling the strong movements of the child who would soon need a world worth growing up in. Some things are more important than safety, she said. Some fights are worth having, even when you can't be sure you'll win. Elias reached across the space between them and took her free hand, his grip warm and steady. Then we'll fight, he said simply, together. As they sat together under stars that had witnessed countless human struggles for justice and dignity, Margaret felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just Margaret Caldwell, the widow fleeing west in search of a new beginning. She was a woman who'd chosen to stand up against corruption, who decided that some battles were too important to leave to others. The baby kicked again, and Margaret smiled as she squeezed Elias's hand. Her child would be born into struggle, but it would also be born into the knowledge that its parents had chosen to fight for something worthy of the sacrifice. In a world where too many people looked the other way when confronted with injustice, that legacy felt like gift enough. The journey to Helena began before dawn, on a morning when frost covered the valley like a silver shroud, and Margaret's breath formed clouds in the crystalline air. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the tension that radiated from its mother despite her attempts to remain calm. Every movement required careful consideration now. She was perhaps 3 weeks from her due date, and the prospect of giving birth on the trail was both terrifying and increasingly possible. Elias had spent the previous evening modifying their saddles and packs to accommodate Margaret's condition, creating a more comfortable seat and redistributing weight so she wouldn't have to carry anything beyond her own body. His attention to such details touched her deeply, evidence of a man who understood that success often depended on small kindnesses as much as grand gestures. "We'll take it slow," he promised, as he helped her mount the steady gelding that had carried her faithfully since their escape from Bitter Creek. 3 days is plenty of time if we don't push too hard." Margaret nodded, though privately she wondered if 3 days would be enough for anything beyond reaching Helena alive. The documents hidden in their saddlebags represented the most damning evidence against Grant's operation ever assembled, but evidence was only powerful if it reached the right hands at the right time. Too much could go wrong during their journey. Pursuit by Grant's men, complications from her pregnancy, or simply the discovery that Territorial Marshal Samuel Crawford was already part of the corruption they were trying to expose. The first day passed without incident, their stolen horses carrying them along mountain trails that Elias seemed to know with intimate familiarity. He'd spent years traveling this country as a rancher, learning routes that connected isolated valleys and settlements, and his knowledge proved invaluable as they navigated terrain that would have been impossible for someone less experienced. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times she caught glimpses of movement in the forest around them, shadows that might have been deer or might have been something more threatening. When she mentioned her concerns to Elias, he nodded grimly. "I've seen them too," he admitted. "At least 2 riders, maybe 3. They're staying well back, but they're definitely following our trail." The knowledge that they were being pursued added urgency to their journey, while simultaneously forcing them to maintain the careful pace that Margaret's condition demanded. It was a cruel mathematics. Every hour they spent resting increased. The likelihood that their pursuers would close the distance, but pushing too hard risked complications that could end their mission before it truly began. "How far back are they?" Margaret asked as they paused beside a mountain stream to water their horses and allow her to rest. "Half a day, maybe less," Elias replied, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. "Professional trackers, by the look of their work. They're not trying to catch us yet, just making sure we don't disappear before they're ready to make their move." Margaret felt the baby shift restlessly inside her, as if responding to the spike of adrenaline that accompanied Elias's words. She'd been hoping their pursuers were simply opportunistic bounty hunters, but professional trackers suggested Grant himself was involved in their pursuit. The implications were sobering. They weren't just racing to reach Helena before their enemies caught up. They were racing against an organization with resources and expertise that far exceeded their own. "What do you think they're waiting for?" she asked. "Orders, most likely," Elias said after a moment's consideration. "Grant probably wants to know what we're carrying before he decides how to handle us. Dead people can't answer questions about missing documents." The observation was both reassuring and terrifying. If Grant's men had orders to take them alive, it meant they had some protection during their journey. But it also meant that capture would likely involve interrogation methods that Margaret preferred not to contemplate, especially given her condition. As they resumed their journey, Margaret found herself thinking about the documents that rode in Elias's saddlebags like a ticking bomb. James's confession alone would be enough to destroy Grant's operation, but the supporting evidence, financial records, correspondence with corrupt officials, detailed accounts of specific crimes, transformed it from accusation into irrefutable proof. The question was whether Marshal Crawford would have the courage and integrity to act on what they brought him. "Tell me about Crawford," she said, as their horses picked their way along a narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. "Do you think he can be trusted?" Elias considered the question carefully before responding. "I've never met him personally, but his reputation suggests he's one of the few territorial officials who can't be bought. He's made enemies by investigating corruption in mining claims and territorial contracts. If anyone has the authority and the will to act on what we're carrying, it would be him. And if he doesn't, Then we find someone who will, Elias replied with quiet determination. Federal marshals, territorial judges, newspaper editors, someone somewhere will care enough about justice to do the right thing. Margaret admired his faith in the system, though her own confidence had been shaken by the depth of corruption they'd discovered. James's documents revealed a network of bought officials and compromised investigators that seemed to include nearly everyone with the power to make a difference. But she also understood that giving up wasn't an option, not when they carried evidence that could prevent other families from suffering the same fate that had befallen the Canes and the Caldwells. The second day brought new challenges as the trail climbed higher into terrain that was increasingly difficult for their horses. Margaret's discomfort increased with the altitude, the baby pressing against her ribs in ways that made breathing difficult, and sitting in the saddle an exercise in endurance. Several times she had to dismount and walk alongside her horse, using the movement to ease cramping that threatened to become something more serious. "We could stop here for the night," Elias suggested as they reached a sheltered meadow where a spring provided fresh water and the surrounding rocks offered protection from wind. "Make camp early. Let you rest properly." Margaret was tempted. Her body was screaming for relief from the constant motion and uncomfortable positioning. But she also knew their pursuers were gaining ground with every hour they delayed. The professional tracking skills that Elias had observed suggested their enemies were better mounted and less encumbered than they were. "How much farther to Helena?" she asked. "If we push hard tomorrow, we can reach the outskirts by evening," Elias replied. "But that means leaving before dawn and maintaining a pace that might be difficult for you." Margaret placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements and trying to judge whether her body could handle another day of hard riding. The child seemed larger and lower than it had just days earlier, and she'd been experiencing irregular contractions that might mean labor was closer than she'd estimated. "Let's make camp," she decided, "but we leave at first light, and we don't stop until we reach Crawford's office." That night, as they huddled around a carefully concealed fire in the shelter of overhanging rocks, Margaret found herself studying Elias's face in the flickering light. The broken man she'd saved from the auction platform was gone, replaced by someone who'd rediscovered his sense of purpose and his capacity for hope. The transformation was remarkable, but it also reminded her of how much they both had to lose if their mission failed. "Elias," she said quietly, "there's something I need you to promise me." He looked up from the rifle he'd been cleaning, his expression growing serious at her tone. "What is it? If something happens to me, if the baby comes early, or if we're captured, you have to promise you'll get those documents to someone who can use them. Don't try to rescue me. Don't let concern for my safety stop you from seeing this through." Elias shook his head immediately. "I'm not leaving you behind, Margaret. We started this together. We'll finish it together. This is bigger than either of us," Margaret insisted. "Those documents represent the only chance for justice that Sarah and Emma will ever have. They're James's last gift to the world, his chance to make things right. You can't let sentiment compromise the mission." "It's not sentiment," Elias replied firmly. "It's the knowledge that some things matter more than the mission. You matter more than the mission." The declaration hung between them like a bridge across previously unbridgeable distance. Margaret felt her heart race as she absorbed the implications of his words, understanding that somewhere during their shared ordeal, their partnership had transformed into something deeper and more complex. "Elias," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know you loved your husband," he said quietly. "I know this baby represents everything you and James hoped to build together. I'm not trying to replace what you lost, and I don't expect you to forget what you had. But I also can't pretend that saving you was just about doing the right thing for a stranger." Margaret felt tears burning her eyes as she recognized the courage it had taken for him to make such a confession. Elias was offering his heart to a woman who was carrying another man's child, committing himself to a future that would always include the memory of someone else's love. "When this is over," she said carefully, "when we've delivered the documents and seen justice done, we'll need to talk about what comes next." "I know," Elias replied. "But right now, all that matters is making sure we live long enough to have that conversation." As they prepared for sleep, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken since James's death. She'd set out west as a grieving widow, seeking nothing more than survival for herself and her unborn child. Now she was a woman carrying evidence that could topple a criminal empire, partnered with a man who'd offered her a future she'd never dared to imagine. The baby kicked strongly, as if reminding her that the future wasn't the only thing at stake. In a few short weeks, she would be responsible for a new life that deserved to grow up in a world where justice was more than just a word. The documents in their saddlebags represented hope for that kind of world, but only if they could reach Helena alive and find someone with the courage to act on what they carried. Dawn would bring the final stage of their journey, the last desperate push toward either vindication or disaster. But as Margaret settled into the uncomfortable rest that was all their circumstances allowed, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the dark days after James's death. The sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The baby quieted as if sharing her calm, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret slept without dreams of pursuit or failure. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought, but tonight, surrounded by mountain silence and watched over by a man who'd learned to fight for something worth preserving, she allowed herself to believe that justice was still possible in a world that had forgotten its meaning. Helena appeared before them like a mirage shimmer in the afternoon heat, its buildings sprawling across the valley floor with the comfortable permanence of a settlement that had survived long enough to call itself a proper town. Margaret felt tears of relief blur her vision as she recognized civilization, real civilization, with law enforcement and federal authority, and the possibility that their desperate gamble might actually succeed. But relief transformed quickly into alarm as the first labor pain struck her like lightning, sharp and unmistakable and perfectly timed to arrive just as their destination came within reach. She gasped, gripping her saddle horn as the contraction rolled through her body with the inexorable force of an avalanche. "Margaret?" Elias's voice carried immediate concern as he noticed her distress. "It's starting," she managed between gritted teeth. "The baby, it's coming now." Elias pulled his horse alongside hers, his face cycling through expressions of panic, determination, and desperate calculation. Helena was perhaps 2 miles away, close enough to see but far enough that reaching it would require time they might not have. "Can you ride a little further?" he asked. "There's a doctor in town, a real one. If we can just—" "Elias." Margaret's voice cut through his planning with quiet authority. "Look behind us." He turned in his saddle and cursed softly at what he saw. Their pursuers had closed the distance significantly, no longer content to simply track their movements. 3 riders were approaching fast, kicking up dust clouds that marked their urgency. Grant's men had apparently decided that the proximity to Helena made immediate action necessary. Margaret felt another contraction building and fought to remain upright in her saddle. The timing was catastrophic. Going into labor while being pursued by armed men, within sight of safety but not close enough to reach it. Every instinct told her to find shelter, to prepare for birth in relative safety, but every rational thought reminded her that capture meant torture and death for both of them. "The marshal's office is in the center of town," Elias said, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "Red brick building with a flag. If we can reach it, we can't outrun them." Margaret interrupted, another wave of pain making speech difficult. "Not with me in this condition," Elias's eyes moved from their pursuers to the town ahead, calculating distances and possibilities with the focused intensity of a man whose military experience had taught him to think tactically under pressure. Margaret watched him consider and discard options, seeing the exact moment when he reached a decision that frightened her. "Give me the documents," he said quietly. "What? The saddlebags with James's confession and all the evidence? Give them to me, and I'll create a distraction that draws them away from you." Margaret understood immediately what he was proposing, a sacrifice play that would give her a chance to reach Helena while he led their pursuers in a different direction. It was tactically sound, but personally unacceptable. "No," she said firmly, despite another contraction that made her vision blur. "We agreed, together or not at all. That was before you went into labor in the middle of hostile territory," Elias replied. "Margaret, be practical. You can barely stay in the saddle, and those men behind us won't hesitate to kill you if they think it serves their purpose." The sound of approaching hoofbeats was growing louder, and Margaret could see individual riders now, hard men with the kind of faces that belonged in wanted posters. They were close enough that she could make out weapons, close enough that any delay would put the outcome beyond doubt. "There's another option," she said suddenly, an idea forming even as another contraction built toward its peak. "We split up, but we both go to Helena. Different routes, different timing." Elias started to object, but Margaret continued with the rapid speech of someone who'd worked out the details, even as she spoke them. "You take the main trail, obvious and fast. They'll follow you because they'll assume you have the documents. I'll take the side path through the residential area, slower but less obvious. We meet at the marshal's office." "Margaret, you're in labor. You can't—" "I can," she interrupted with steel in her voice. "I've come too far to quit now." Another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones, and Margaret had to close her eyes and breathe deeply to remain conscious. When it passed, she opened her eyes to find Elias staring at her with an expression of wonder and terror. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure," Margaret replied, though privately she wondered if her body would cooperate with her determination. Long enough to reach safety. They separated at a fork in the trail, Elias heading directly toward Helena's main street, while Margaret guided her horse toward a residential area where houses and gardens might provide cover. The last thing she saw of him was his straight back in the saddle as he rode toward their pursuers, drawing danger away from her with the same instinctive protectiveness that had characterized every decision he'd made since their partnership began. The side trail proved to be even more difficult than Margaret had anticipated. Her horse had to pick its way carefully between vegetable gardens and chicken coops, past houses where curious residents peered through windows at the pregnant woman riding alone through their neighborhood. Each contraction made staying mounted more difficult, and she found herself gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination. Behind her, she could hear the sound of pursuit shifting away as their enemies followed Elias toward the main part of town. The deception was working, but she had no way of knowing whether he could stay ahead of them long enough for her to reach the marshal's office. A particularly strong contraction forced her to dismount and lean against her horse for support, breathing deeply while fighting the urge to find shelter and prepare for birth. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, but she still had a mission to complete. James's documents rode in her saddlebags like a sacred trust, and she would deliver them to someone with the authority to act, even if it meant giving birth. On the steps of the marshal's office, the red brick building came into view, just as another wave of pain made her knees buckle. Margaret could see the territorial flag hanging from a pole beside the entrance, could see people moving in and out of the building with the casual efficiency of government business. Safety was perhaps 50 yards away, but 50 yards felt like 50 miles when every step brought fresh agony. She remounted her horse with determination born of desperation, knowing that walking would take too long and that another contraction might leave her unable to move at all. The gelding seemed to sense her urgency, carrying her toward the marshal's office with steady purpose while she fought to remain upright in the saddle. The sound of gunfire erupted from the main street, sharp reports that echoed off buildings and sent people scrambling for cover. Margaret's heart clenched with fear for Elias, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Whatever was happening elsewhere in Helena, her job was to reach Marshal Crawford and deliver the evidence that could end Grant's reign of terror. 20 yards from the marshal's office, the most powerful contraction yet struck her like a physical blow. Margaret cried out involuntarily, her vision graying at the edges as her body prepared for birth, whether she was ready or not. She slumped forward in her saddle, one hand gripping the reins, while the other pressed against her belly, where the baby seemed determined to make its entrance into the world. "Help," she called weakly, her voice barely carrying over the sounds of commotion from the main street. "Someone help me." A man emerged from the marshal's office, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight as he hurried toward her. Margaret had never seen Marshal Samuel Crawford before, but his face held the kind of weathered integrity that gave her hope even as another contraction threatened to topple her from her horse. "Ma'am, what's wrong?" he asked, reaching up to steady her in the saddle. "I have something for you," Margaret gasped, fumbling for the saddlebags that contained James's confession. Evidence about Bartholomew Grant and his operation, federal crimes, territorial corruption. Crawford's expression sharpened with interest even as he helped her dismount. "Let's get you inside first," he said firmly. "Then we can talk about whatever you're carrying." As Margaret felt strong hands supporting her toward the safety of the marshal's office, she heard more gunfire from the direction Elias had taken. Her heart ached with worry for the man who'd risked everything to ensure she reached this moment, but she also felt a fierce satisfaction that their mission was finally reaching its conclusion. The baby kicked strongly, as if celebrating their arrival at safety, and Margaret smiled despite her pain. Whatever happened next, James's confession would finally reach someone with the authority to act on it. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally within their grasp. Marshal Crawford's office became a battlefield of competing urgencies as Margaret fought to deliver both evidence and baby, while gunfire continued to echo through Helena's streets. The marshal had cleared his desk and helped her lie down, but his attention kept shifting between her obvious distress and the documents. She'd pressed into his hands with trembling fingers. "These papers," he said, scanning James's confession with growing amazement. "Ma'am, if this is genuine, we're looking at the biggest corruption case in territorial history." "It's genuine," Margaret gasped between contractions. "My husband wrote it before Grant had him killed. Everything's documented, names, dates, amounts of money." Crawford's face hardened as he read deeper into the confession, his weathered features settling into expressions of disgust and determination. "Grant's been operating under federal protection. No wonder none of our investigations got anywhere." Another wave of pain forced Margaret to grip the edge of the desk, her body demanding attention that her mind wanted to devote to ensuring Crawford understood the magnitude of what she'd brought him. Through the office windows, she could see people running past in response to the continuing gunfire, and her heart clenched with fear for Elias. "There's a man with me," she managed. "Elias Kane. Grant's men are chasing him through your town right now. He risked everything to get me here safely." Crawford looked up from the documents, his expression shifting to one of recognition. "Elias Kane, I know that name. There was a report about him being sold at auction in Bitter Creek. I bought him," Margaret said, then immediately realized how that sounded. "I mean, I bid on his freedom to get him away from those monsters. He's been helping me gather evidence ever since." The marshal moved to his gun cabinet, removing a rifle and checking its load with practiced efficiency. "Deputy Morrison," he called to a young man who'd been hovering uncertainly near the door. "Send word to Sheriff Patterson that we need every available man to secure Bartholomew Grant and his associates. Tell him it's federal authority. Anyone who interferes will answer to Washington." Margaret felt a surge of relief that Crawford was taking immediate action, but another contraction reminded her that her body had its own priorities. The baby was coming whether the world was ready or not, and she needed to focus on the practical realities of giving birth in a territorial marshal's office. "Marshal," she said with as much dignity as her circumstances allowed, "I'm going to need a doctor. This baby isn't waiting for your investigation to conclude." Crawford's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the awkwardness of the situation. "Of course, ma'am. Morrison, find Doc Henderson and tell him we have a medical emergency, and get Mrs. Patterson. She's assisted with births before." The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the windows, and Margaret's heart leaped as she recognized the distinctive outline of Elias on his stolen mare. He was riding hard, his head down and his body moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd been born to the saddle. Behind him, perhaps 50 yards back, 3 riders were gaining ground despite his obvious skill. "That's him," Margaret said, urgently. "That's Elias." Crawford shouldered his rifle and moved toward the door, his deputy following with determined loyalty. "Ma'am, you just concentrate on having that baby. We'll handle the rest." What followed was the strangest few minutes of Margaret's life, lying on a marshal's desk in active labor while a gunfight erupted in the street outside. She could hear Crawford's voice shouting orders, could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire and the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth. Through it all, her body continued its ancient work of bringing new life into the world, indifferent to the chaos surrounding it. Mrs. Patterson arrived just as Margaret's water broke, a competent woman in her 50s who took charge of the situation, with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd delivered babies in frontier conditions before. "All right, dear," she said calmly, as if gunfights and childbirth were everyday occurrences. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." The gunfire outside reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. Margaret strained to hear what was happening, desperate to know if Elias had survived the confrontation. Then she heard his voice calling her name, and relief flooded through her with almost physical force. "I'm here," she called back weakly. "I'm all right." Elias appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with dust and his shirt torn, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. "The evidence?" "Safe," Margaret replied, then gasped as another contraction reminded her that their mission was only part of what demanded her attention. "The baby's coming now." Mrs. Patterson looked up from her examination with professional assessment. "Soon," she agreed. "Very soon. Mr. Kane, I assume? You might want to wait outside for this part." But Elias moved closer instead, his face reflecting a mixture of concern and wonder. "If Margaret doesn't mind, I'd like to stay. We've been through everything else together." Margaret reached for his hand, finding strength in his steady presence, even as her body prepared for the final stage of birth. "Stay," she whispered. "Please." Marshal Crawford appeared behind Elias, his expression grim but satisfied. "Grant's men are in custody," he reported. "1 dead, 2 wounded, but we got them all. And I've already sent word to the territorial governor about these documents. This investigation is going federal as of right now." Margaret felt a wave of triumph that almost eclipsed the physical sensations of impending birth. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd delivered the evidence that would bring justice for Sarah and Emma Kane, for James Caldwell, and for all the other victims of Grant's systematic cruelty. "Push now, dear," Mrs. Patterson instructed, her voice carrying the calm authority of experience. "This baby's ready to meet the world." Margaret bore down with all her remaining strength, thinking about the child who would be born into a world where justice was possible, where corruption had consequences, where 2 people who'd lost everything could build something worth fighting for. The pain was intense but purposeful, each contraction bringing her closer to holding the future in her arms. "I can see the head," Mrs. Patterson announced with satisfaction. "1 more good push should do it." Margaret squeezed Elias's hand and gathered herself for the final effort, thinking about James and the dreams they'd shared, about Sarah and Emma Kane and the justice they deserved, about the man beside her who'd learned to hope again despite everything he'd endured. This baby would be born into struggle, but it would also be born into love and the knowledge that its parents had chosen to fight for something bigger than themselves. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, Margaret brought her child into the world. The baby's first cry was strong and healthy, a sound that seemed to announce that despite everything, corruption, violence, loss, and hardship, life continued, hope endured, and new beginnings were always possible. "It's a girl," Mrs. Patterson announced with a smile. "A beautiful, healthy girl." As Elias helped Margaret sit up to hold her daughter for the first time, she looked into tiny eyes that seemed to hold infinite possibility. The baby was perfect. James's nose, her own stubborn chin, and an expression of alert curiosity that suggested she was already assessing this strange new world she'd been born into. "What will you call her?" Elias asked softly, his voice full of wonder at the miracle he'd just witnessed. Margaret looked at the man who'd risked everything to help her reach this moment, then down at the daughter who represented both her past, love, and her hope for the future. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Outside, Helena was returning to normal as news of Grant's arrest spread through the town. But inside the marshal's office, three people who'd found each other against impossible odds looked toward a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of their rebuilt cabin in Haven Valley, watching Elias teach baby Hope the fine art of holding her head steady while sitting propped against his knee. The morning sun painted the meadow in shades of gold and green, and the sound of the stream provided a gentle counterpoint to Hope's delighted gurgles as she discovered the fascinating texture of Elias's calloused fingers. The intervening months had transformed all their lives in ways that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days of flight and pursuit. The federal investigation triggered by James's confession had exposed corruption that reached from territorial offices all the way to Washington, resulting in arrests, resignations, and reforms that were still reshaping Montana Territory's political landscape. Bartholomew Grant himself had been sentenced to life in prison, his vast network of forced labor operations dismantled, and his stolen properties returned to their rightful owners. "She's going to be stubborn," Elias observed as Hope grabbed his thumb with surprising strength and refused to let go. "Wonder where she gets that from?" Margaret smiled, settling beside them on the porch steps they'd built to replace the simple threshold of their original construction. The cabin had grown over the winter months, expanding from their desperate shelter into something that resembled a proper home. A second room for Hope, a kitchen with the salvage stove, and windows that looked out over the valley in all 4 directions. It wasn't the grand homestead that James had dreamed of, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, and defended against forces that had seemed insurmountable. "The territorial governor wants to offer you a position," Margaret said, returning to a conversation they'd been having intermittently for weeks. "Something about organizing an anti-corruption task force." Elias considered this, while Hope continued her determined examination of his hand. "It's tempting," he admitted, "knowing there's still work to be done, still people who need protection from men like Grant. But I've learned something about building versus fighting," Elias replied thoughtfully. "Fighting corruption is important work, but building something worth protecting feels more important right now." Margaret understood exactly what he meant. The months they'd spent transforming Haven Valley into a home had taught her that creation was often more powerful than destruction, that the best response to darkness was sometimes simply to kindle a light and tend it carefully. Hope represented the ultimate expression of that philosophy. A new life brought into the world not through conquest or violence, but through love and determination. The baby released Elias's thumb and turned her attention to the wooden rattle. He'd carved for her a simple toy that represented hours of patient work during the long winter evenings when snow had made outside labor impossible. Margaret watched her daughter's intense concentration and felt her heart swell with fierce protectiveness. This child would grow up knowing safety, knowing that the people who loved her would fight for her future, but would also build something worthy of that future. Marshal Crawford sent word that the last of Grant's associates were sentenced yesterday, Margaret said, sharing news that had arrived with the morning mail delivery. 20 years for human trafficking, 15 for corruption of federal officials. Justice, finally. Sarah and Emma would have liked knowing that, Elias replied quietly. Not that it brings them back, but knowing that what happened to them mattered. Enough for someone to see it through to the end. Margaret reached across the space between them and took his free hand, feeling the wedding ring they'd crafted from silver found in their own stream. The ceremony had been simple, just the three of them and Marshal Crawford in the Helena courthouse, with Hope sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms as they exchanged vows that acknowledged both their past losses and their shared hope for the future. James would have liked it too, she said, knowing that his confession led to real change, that his death wasn't in vain. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter explore the world with the fearless curiosity of someone who'd never known anything but love and security. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the auction platform in Bitter Creek, the desperate flight into the wilderness, the gradual transformation from broken people into a family. None of it had been planned, none of it had followed the neat patterns of the romance novels she'd read as a young woman, but all of it had led to this. A morning in their own valley with their own child, and the knowledge that they'd fought for. Something worth preserving. There's something I've been thinking about, Elias said, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when introducing topics that required discussion rather than decision. About expanding. The cabin, Margaret asked, though she suspected he meant something different. The family, Elias clarified, his face coloring slightly with embarrassment. I know Hope isn't biologically mine, but she feels like mine in every way that matters. And I keep thinking about other children we might have together, children who'd grow up here with her. Margaret felt her heart flutter with possibilities she'd been afraid to voice herself. Hope was thriving in their mountain valley, but she was also growing up without the companionship of other children. The idea of siblings, of expanding their small family into something larger and more complex, held tremendous appeal. I think, she said carefully, that Hope would like having brothers and sisters to boss around. Elias's smile was radiant as he understood her meaning. She does seem to have strong opinions about how things should be done. Hope chose that moment to throw her rattle with remarkable accuracy, bonking Elias on the nose and dissolving into delighted laughter at her own cleverness. Both adults burst into laughter as well, and the sound echoed across the valley like a declaration of joy. As the morning progressed and they began their daily routines, Elias checking on their small herd of cattle, Margaret tending the garden that would feed them through the coming winter, Margaret found herself thinking about the circular nature of their story. She'd come west seeking a new beginning after loss, had found instead a purpose that transformed loss into something meaningful. The broken cowboy she'd saved from an auction platform had become the foundation of a new life, and the evidence of corruption she'd carried across hostile territory had blossomed into justice for countless victims. But perhaps most importantly, the child she'd carried in her womb during months of danger and uncertainty had been born into a world where love was possible, where justice could triumph over corruption, where two people who'd lost everything could build something beautiful from the ashes of their previous lives. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table with Hope babbling contentedly in her high chair, Margaret realized that this was what victory looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but simply the quiet persistence of love in the face of forces that would destroy it. They'd faced down corruption, survived pursuit by armed men, and delivered justice to those who'd thought themselves above the law. But their greatest triumph was this: a family dinner in a cabin they'd built with their own hands, in a valley where their daughter would grow up knowing that her parents had chosen hope over despair. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities they were only beginning to imagine. More children, perhaps. Expansion of their small ranch, visitors drawn by their story of triumph over corruption, the gradual transformation of Haven Valley from hideout to home to legacy. But for now, Margaret was content to sit beside the stream, where they'd found James's confession, watching Elias skip stones, while Hope clapped her hands in delight at each splash. The evening light painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of rain. She'd buried her first husband with her bare hands in frozen Montana ground, had saved a broken cowboy from an auction platform, had carried evidence of corruption across hostile territory while carrying new life in her womb. The story that had begun with loss and desperation had become something larger, a testament to the power of love to transform tragedy into triumph, of hope to overcome even the darkest circumstances. As the stars began to appear above Haven Valley, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd chosen to fight for what mattered and had discovered that some battles really could be won. Their daughter would grow up in a world where such victories were possible, where two broken hearts could refuse to stay buried and build something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered dreams. In the West, salvation did indeed come in strange forms. Sometimes it looked like a woman with nothing left to give, giving someone a reason to live again. Sometimes it looked like a man who'd lost everything, finding the courage to build something new. And sometimes it looked like a family sitting beside a mountain stream, counting stars and believing in tomorrow. The story of Margaret Caldwell and Elias Kane would become legend in Montana territory. The pregnant widow who'd exposed corruption, and the broken cowboy she'd saved from slavery. But the real story was simpler and more profound. Two people who'd chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the past. In a world that often forgot the value of such choices, their example would endure long after the last echoes of their struggle had faded into memory.